Data protection and privacy teams are under more pressure than ever with new laws, AI oversight, data breaches, and the constant expectation to do more with fewer resources.
That's why TrustArc built a modern privacy and data protection management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. It unifies your tools, automates the work that slows you down, and surfaces what matters most right when you need it.
From guided quick actions to our intelligent assistant, Ask Arc, you get credible, contextual answers backed by expert research, not generic AI guesses.
Finally, privacy that works the way privacy pros work.
Learn how TrustArc helps teams move faster with confidence at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.
You're listening to Serious Privacy by TrustArc. Please welcome our hosts, Paul Breitbarth and Kay Royal.
An entrepreneur who cares about personal freedom. That is how today's guest describes himself on his LinkedIn page. Markus Lampinen is the co-founder and CEO of Prifina, building an open data market where individuals gain value from their data and developers get democratized data access. In other words, developers get to work with large amounts of data, for example from personal wearable devices like smartwatches, without being able to actually touch the data themselves. That is possible because all data would be stored in private personal data clouds that only the individuals can access. This sounds like another great privacy by design approach to using data. But how does it really work? Can this approach be truly effective with only local processing being available? I'm sure Markus will be able to tell us all about it. My name is Paul Breitbarth.
And I'm Kay Royal, and welcome to Serious Privacy. So, y'all can probably guess what I'm going to say next. I am so excited to have our guest here today, but I'm excited about all topics privacy, but I really am excited about this one. We've been kind of on this kick lately of talking to entrepreneurs and new tech startup companies and everything that have privacy as their focus, and I love watching the growth of this technology. So, Markus, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Today's unexpected question. This one ought to be interesting. Let's see. Today, you destroyed what?
Well, my day's only starting here in California, so geez. I haven't really got that far yet. I guess I destroyed a bagel in the morning, but that's the extent of my destruction. So, so far so good.
We can go recently. We can say this week you destroyed. I mean, it's Tuesday, so.
Well, I did get some nice plates to our house, and they got, mushed in the crate. So I guess that counts.
That counts.
Yeah, that counts. That's a very physical destruction. So, I'll talk that one.
That's a very physical destruction. I love it. Paul, what have you destroyed today or this week?
Well, I wanted to say somebody's reputation, but I haven't managed to do that yet. I have absolutely no idea. I've only been working, so maybe I've destroyed some drafts for a paper I'm writing. I think that might be the only thing. It's pretty boring.
To say, because y'all all know it's an unexpected question for me too, because I just flip through and randomly pick one. What have I destroyed today? I could go with Markus and say I destroyed my coffee. I haven't yet destroyed my diet, so I'm good there. I have probably, however, already destroyed my to-do list for today. It's probably way out of here and I need a new one.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one.
And by destroyed, I don't mean accomplished in any way, form, or matter. Okay, let's move on to the topic of today. So, Paul, honor of the first question, sir.
Sure. Markus, you told us before we started recording you're Finnish, but having grown up in the US, what is your professional background and how did you end up founding Prifina? Where is all of this coming from?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like you said, I'm originally Finnish. I'm a Finnish engineer. I've been working with technology for a while. And I'm very fortunate. This is actually the third company that I get to found. And it's the second company that I get to found and run with largely the same team as well. This idea of, let's say, personal ownership or control of data, it kind of matured a very, very long way. So just as background, we have in our team, we have two folks that started the world's first social media data analytics company in 2004. So this is, when Facebook was launched, but when it really didn't yet exist. And they started essentially modeling influence and patterns of behavior using individual data in 2004, 2005. Now, the company raised a boatload of venture capital and it was sold in 2008. But they actually had this one idea that they patented in 2005 and it was kind of this very, very simple thesis that these organizations are using this data and they're extracting massive amounts of value from it. But why can't I as an individual use my data? Like, why can't I actually benefit from this? And of course, raising a boatload of venture money, you don't get to, you're not afforded to go after every single idea. So they kind of parked that one. But then when we started looking at a lot of the policy changes that you'll also talk about, like the GDPRs and the CCPAs of the world, then we started realizing that this is actually maturing. And it's maturing with not just essentially the privacy regulations, but it's also maturing with this fact that we start to have so much data, like as individuals. And if you kind of think about it from the flip side, that enterprises have this fantastic tooling for utilizing it, but we don't have anything. So that's kind of where we started from this, that I'm a product engineer, I have a computer science background, economics background, and kind of looking at this from, let's say, an evolution of the internet, then it started kind of dawn on us that maybe the future of data in 10 years, maybe it looks completely different to what we have today. Because we've got very set on this idea that we have a few companies that dominate all of the data in the world. But that wasn't always like that. And there's no guarantee that that's going to be the case in 10 years, that it actually might even seem like an improbable case that, in 10 years, there'll only be a few companies that dominate everything. But
might it not be too late for data ownership? I mean, when I joined the Dutch Data Protection Authority back in 2009, they had just commissioned a study that showed that an average citizen that didn't have a lot of interactions would already be in 1,500 databases. That's 12 and a half years ago. That number would have been multiplied by, I don't know, maybe a factor of 10 by now. Is it still possible to keep control or get back control over our own data?
So let me kind of continue that thought a little bit. So I was working on my last company, which was a fintech company, when they rolled out the data portability laws in essentially GDPR, but also then the open banking regulations and so on and so forth. And at first, I was incredibly excited because I was like, you get an open ecosystem, data flows, you can create more value and so on and so forth. But after a couple of years, I started getting very cynical because I realized that the problem that you just stated, it got put on steroids. That individual data got copied into every single one of the databases, and it got kind of ping-pong back and forth, which effectively created an incredibly bloated data privacy risk and data breach risk. But it also was, in a way, really poorly organized because you end up with these 1,500 or so databases, which are all more or less out of date because you can't keep 1,500 databases up to date. There's just no way. So in a way, I think that, you're absolutely right on the money that it might be too late to change that. But at the same time, apps are being built all the time. You have new applications, new services, and new companies founded. So affecting effectively how they approach data, that's probably the more healthy alternative. So in a way, you can think about it that if you are a developer starting to create some really incredible stress optimization app, then how you approach data might be actually quite different today than what it was 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago, it was all about data hoarding, that, let's get all the data in the world and we'll figure out what we do with it afterwards. But
and
nowadays,
that's changed?
I think for some developers, you also see this, that they're a lot more, they recognize that holding a lot of PII is not just a gold mine, it's also a risk. And it's something that, if they want to do, then especially holding on to a lot of stuff that they're not using, it might not be the best way forward. But I think it's also...
I think that's a bit optimistic, but I like that.
I think I'll give you that. It is optimistic because on the developer side, we see it less. But we do see that from the end user side, that there are a certain type of use case, certain type of data sets that end users, so people like you and I, were just a little bit more reluctant to share. Like, I'll give you an example. Right. So I have a buddy of mine that started a really, really cool company that does specific diet recommendations based on blood work. So you essentially upload your your blood markers, and then you have your wearable data, and then they give you bespoke like vitamins and supplements and all sorts of different things. And I thought that, as an engineer, like super cool. But then when it came to actually me testing it out and handing my blood work to essentially, in this case, a friend of mine, but still, a third-party company that's optimizing their business model, then I just had this ringing in my ear that, Marcus, this might not be the best idea. So I think the consumer sentiment is probably the thing that you're absolutely right that it is early. Like consumers, myself included, are very utilitarian. Like whatever gives you the most value, that's what you'll go for. We like to think that consumers are very educated in privacy and security and so on and so forth. I don't believe that. I think that consumers, myself included, just go after value. But I think there is...
And value in the moment, not even usually long-term value. It's value in the moment. Absolutely. Right now, this is what I need and this is what I'm willing to trade without thinking tomorrow when I don't need this, they still have the data.
That's right. That's right. And I think this is something that if you can actually deliver this value using essentially a different approach to data, I think that's where you can see this type of a delta and change. So what I mean by that is practical things like a lot of times when companies built out different types of products that use data sets, they'll use segments and profiles and so on and so forth. And that can be very personal, but it's never going to be you. It's never going to be individually just you. So that's the thing, that if you can actually utilize your own data and utilize even more of it, you can get this hyperlocal set of recommendations. It doesn't matter for all applications, but for example, the segment that we're interested in health and well-being, I don't care about somebody else's sleep. I care about my own sleep and my own stress levels.
Okay, fair enough. I like that. Oh, that's funny. When I just said fair enough, my granddaughter, 7 years old, just started repeating me for everything being fair enough. Like, oh, wait till she goes home and starts telling her parents, fair enough, fair enough.
You should be home by 10. Fair enough.
Yeah, fair enough. At least the little 2-year-old boy got off his kick of repeating me going, wow, wow. But okay, all right, next. So I love it. So it motivated you to create your next startup company and what you're working on. So tell us what it is that you're doing. And I think of this as particularly a consumer-focused episode where what we're doing or what you're doing can help the average person. And how is this going to help them? How does this work?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. The way that we think of our company is that at the end of the day, it's a marketplace. So it's a way for developers and builders, companies of all types, to build new types of applications on this model where the data stays with the user. But for then the individual, it's to use applications that are very personal to you without actually sharing any data. So we like to kind of simplify it in this way, that in the framework that we've built, the applications come to you and your data, as opposed to you and your data going to the applications. And it's a very, very subtle nuance, but I think it's also something that's kind of developing in some other platforms as well. Like, for example, in the iOS platform, there's this concept of unloading apps instead of deleting them, which means that you're actually deleting the apps or uninstalling the apps, but you're keeping the log files. So you're keeping your settings and your preferences and so on and so forth. So in a way, this is similar, that you get to keep the data, you get to run the application with the data itself, but you're not sharing it with a third. I have one investor who kind of created this one slogan for me about a year and a half ago. And at the start, I didn't really like it, but it's kind of grown on me over time. And he compares sharing data to organic food. That he has this very simplified way of thinking about it, where he says that, you know that organic food is going to be slightly better for you. And if you've got a choice, then most likely you're going to go for that. And you know that sharing your data with everybody, it's slightly bad for you, but you don't really have a choice. So if you were given a choice that, do you want to use this application and share your data externally, or do you want to just hold on to your data? Then guess what? This is where essentially the hypothesis comes in, that most people are just going to choose that, hey, why don't I just retain the data? Because you don't have to be super educated about data to even realize that if you're sharing it externally and you're not getting something back, then why do it? And this is something where if we think about what type of signals we have that this behavior is changing, in the, I think it was the iOS 14.5 updates, there was this, they introduced a button that ask app not to track. And there was a lot of research earlier and predictions that, consumers would say 50-50, that app can track, app cannot track, and so on and so forth. But the research that came out was really devastating because it was like practically everybody outside of misclick said that, don't track. Because the reality is that you might not mind the app tracking, but if you're not getting anything from it, why would you? Like, what's the incentive? Asking and kind of, even positioning in that way, in a slightly creepy way, that do you want an app that you don't necessarily trust to track you? Then why would you? So this is kind of the better alternative that we're trying to create. Now, we're not idealists, so we know that this is something that happens slowly. And that's why we focused on the developers, because we know software developers, and we know that they also face a lot of friction at the start in terms of how to build on data, because unless they're, a huge company like one of the data giants, and they don't have a lot of data, they need to get it from somewhere. So for them to start kind of plugging into different data silos, using different formats, using different types of incompatible data sets, then that's a huge ordeal. And we make that easier because we kind of have this data layer where we create a uniform format and then enrich this data. But then in order to use that, then you buy into this premise that you're actually letting the user keep the data.
Right.
So it's sort of like, it's value right away for the developer, but then it also comes at a cost, so to speak. But we think that cost is justified because that cost basically means that they're in a way showing their users a little bit more respect as it comes to their data.
Right. And yesterday on LinkedIn, there was a post that I was involved with about how software engineers or programmers, how many of them are trained in privacy. And a lot of comments were probably less than 1%. And I think that's a little cynical. I think a lot of companies do their best to well, maybe not do their best. A lot of companies provide privacy and security training, at least on a general level. And you're supposed to provide it on a role-based specific level. So software engineers who are programming using data sets should get training based on what it is they're doing. And you're saying that once they have that training or they're alert to that knowledge, that they would want to use data in a more responsible manner.
Well, maybe I would put it this way, that I think everybody has, or most people have the right intentions. But this is just really hard. That oftentimes where developers
I like that.
where developers start is they start building, and then once they get going and once they have momentum and they have users, and then they realize that, oh shoot, I should change this, then it might already be too late.
Yeah.
Because that means that they would have to take down the system, they would have to tell their investors that, hold up, we messed up, we need to redo this. And most people at that point, they're very, let's say, short-sighted in that sense, that it may very well be that, in 5 years, the sentiment is completely turned. And it may be in 5 years that, engineering a product that uses data in a way that it is not privacy by design, then that would be an absolute no-no. That's not the case today. So today, people are a little bit more conscious, but, you can still get away with a bunch of stuff in the enterprise setting. But I do think it's something that for the developer, if essentially we can impact how they start, and if we can give them the better way of building an app where they can use even richer data than they otherwise would, and they can get started in a couple of days and essentially delight their users right away with a product that essentially they can power with their data, then if that's essentially, let's say, a really, really simple build for them, why would they do the other route? And that's kind of the way that we're approaching this, that instead of trying to penalize them and, go out and kind of change their thinking, we give them essentially a better way, which has all of this built in. Because if they can prove it out, they can get value, they can impress their clients, they can get more users, then fantastic. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what they care about. Like they want to make somebody's life better, whether or not it's an enterprise or then individual consumers. But that's ultimately where they make their money and they build their reputation. So I think we have to kind of approach it from a very, very long-term point of view, that we can't go out and say that, what's happening today. And yes, there's more education and there's more insight into these problems. But at the end of the day, I think we just have to kind of, give the pickaxes and the tools and say that, hey, here's a really cool way of building these apps. And then lo and behold, they realize later that, oh, this is actually something that guarantees that, we're not, left holding the hot potato later on. And then the end users can say that, hey, actually, this is something I'm not overexposed by the way that I'm using these applications.
So would it require a completely different way of engineering, a different way of thinking?
So the short answer is no, and then the long answer is it depends.
Oh, I love that answer. It's my favorite answer in privacy. It depends.
He loves that answer.
But this is, this is especially true in this context, that it really depends on what you're doing. So in a way, our model, you can use all the data engineering techniques that you're using. You can use all the most modern frameworks to build the application. That all is completely the same. But it does require you to shift your mindset slightly. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So in a typical, well, quote unquote, a typical engineering or data engineering problem, you might have 1 million users in one database, and you might have a very, very narrow data set of them. Let's say, you have demographic information like ages, where they live, and then you might have some type of data object like, let's say, heart rate data. So you'll have a huge pool of users, heart rate data, and then some of those socioeconomics. In our model, you don't have that. In our model, you have one user, but then you have basically in that one user's data lake or data cloud, as we call it, you have everything about them. So that means that from a data engineering point of view, you can't filter by age. Because in that huge table, you can filter by age and then compare heart rates. But in our model, I'm always going to be 35, at least at this time of the year. And then, for me, you have to kind of apply a different technique. Like you have to apply, for example, timestamps as you're filtering. Like what type of data was updated within 1 and 2 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, for example. And that way you can kind of create a different type. So in that sense, that's kind of where the depends comes in, that it depends on what you're trying to do. So you have to approach it slightly differently. It's not a non-trivial challenge. It does require a new way of doing things. But it's also a huge opportunity because, for example, in some of the machine learning contexts that we've been looking at and exploring with some of the developers and some of the companies, then machine learning, oftentimes you take that big data table and then you start optimizing it based on new data in and so on and so forth. What do you do when you don't have that big data table? Well, you can actually do the federated learning model where you can essentially apply what Apple is doing. For example, Apple and Google are doing on their phones, where they're essentially pushing out an algorithm to the phone. They're letting it train there on the phone. And then they're sharing the result, not the data, but the result, and then comparing the results. So in a way, you can do the same thing with our system as well. So these are just a couple examples why it is slightly different, and it depends slightly on what you're doing, and it does require a different type of approach. But I would say this is also our responsibility as a company, that we just have to have these libraries and these quick starts for these builders so that it's not an onerous issue. It's something that's rather simple, and there's examples, and here's how you do this in this environment. I would compare it to just just the different platforms that you have. Like very similar how you create an iOS app and you create an Android app. Then you can create an app on Prifina, which essentially has this data architecture. But it's no different than just creating an app on one of those different platforms.
So even an app that would be all about connectivity, say I want to develop a new privacy-friendly dating app. Would that work with your technology? Because in the end, it's all about making the connection.
It would. So it's actually a super interesting use case. And not just the dating, but all sorts of type of connected marketplaces. So in a way, if you think about it, then in the traditional way, the user ends up in a huge server pool of different types of users, and the matches are made there. Well, in our model, we actually don't have a server. We have no servers in our company, which means that we also don't have logs. So whatever you use, applications or data for, we have no way of knowing. And then you control your private key. So we would have no way of actually accessing anything that you've got either. But that also means that because we don't have servers, then your profile is not going into a server pool, but it's rather creating these connections peer-to-peer, which ends up in this kind of distributed mesh of connections. And this is where effectively it becomes super cool, because you would effectively opt into all of these connections being made, and there would be an algorithm that looks at who opted into different types of matches. Now, I'll give you a non-dating example, because the dating one gets hairy quite quickly. But take, for example, mortgages. Something as boring as mortgages. We can't make that, Harry.
Well, we could.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you think, for example, about a person, like you have a person, you have their income, you have their, life situations and all sorts of different types of things. You shouldn't have to send that to a bank to get approved for a mortgage or to find which mortgage is the right one for you. So you could actually run that algorithm locally with the user, and you could determine that based on these criteria, which bank is the likeliest to give me the best rate. And then only after you pre-qualify them, then you would make that connection. The same is true of any type of marketplace, that you're just essentially taking the algorithm and then you're removing it from the company, or not necessarily removing it, but you're giving the individual as well their own algorithm that can then essentially represent. So this goes on to a little bit of an aside, but one of the visions that we have for Prifina is that I mentioned at the start that we have all of this data and we're not really able to use it. Well, it goes a little bit beyond that. All of the enterprises, they also have lots of really, really sophisticated algorithms, pricing engines, different types of AI programs and whatnot that optimize based on the enterprise's needs. Well, me as an individual, I want those too. And I want those to represent me. I want to own the algorithms that look after what is the right airfare price for me and my family. So this is where essentially, if we can take not just the data, but also some of the compute and give that to the individual, then that can be pretty cool, because that's especially in areas like health and wellness, that if you can actually drive up the user agency and essentially have different intelligence that really works on for the user's benefit, then this kind of comes to these problems that when you asked about like what was, let's say, the impetus for starting this company, then it was really this, that we see a future where individuals can actually have more agency utilizing their data, and that can really empower more of this, personal freedom, but also personal choice and, agency overall. So that's one of the things that really resonates with our team, that if we can get there, that it's not just data, but it's also the things that you have working for you, then that can be pretty cool.
And what's the uptake been with developers
I think for developers, so you probably can tell, but I'm personally a data geek. Like I love playing with data and all sorts of different
I didn't get that impression at all, Markus.
No, that's right. So we've had a strong uptake from that type of community. So we've had over 20,000 software developers and data scientists tinker around with all sorts of different types of applications, combining different types of data sets. Things that are, crazy in that sense, that you have, for example, somebody looked at how can you reduce stress? So taking stress as like some of the wearable readings, like heart rate variability. So how can you reduce that by playing different types of music that the individual responds to that lowers their stress? That was pretty cool. But then they realized that the phone actually has Shazam built in, which listens to ambient noise. So not just music that you play, but also things that you hear in the background. And then they started looking at, okay, how does your heart rate and your stress levels react to your environment? So things like these. Now, it's an open marketplace, which means that I'm not the judge. I'm not going to say that this is a great app or this is a poor app. It's really the end users, that if you get value from it, then fantastic. Like that's proof enough. But that's been great. I think for the developers, the access to data aspect is actually quite fundamental, that just being able to quickly build something and make it valuable for the end user, that's a really, really big selling point. But we also get this moral driver from a lot of the developers. So one of the things that we started doing when we got this uptake from developers, we started asking them that, hey, why are you here? Like, nobody knows about our company. Why are you coming to us? And so on. And we had over 4,000 people say that data with the user resonates and it's, quote, the right thing to do. And that's something that at the time, I started just seeing that pattern emerge from the responses, that the data is the individual's, it's their own data, so it should stay with the individual. And I started thinking that, maybe there's something there. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know how that represents a broader sentiment, how that represents, let's say, the data engineer, that type of sentiment. But it is an interesting thing, because I think you see this in different markets, that markets, they tend to develop very incrementally, but at some points they also switch, where they just something clicks and something, a model can change overnight practically. And for example, you remember that we had Blu-ray and the other technology. And then there was a huge competition about which one's going to win out. And then streaming came and it didn't matter. So right. I think in a way we're at this interesting point in time where that type of similar consumer switch may happen. And it's not just the consumer. I mean, Paul mentioned earlier that I'm originally from Europe, and especially in the EU is driving this really, really hard in terms of new types of a new EU data strategy and new futures for individuals to have more ownership and value and control and privacy and yada, yada, yada. So there's something that's cooking there. For the end users, I mean, developers is something that we know. And for developers, it's really the ability to create amazing apps as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. And of course, in a way that doesn't end up biting them in the ass in 2 years. And that's also a really, really key thing for them. For the end users, it's really about the applications. Like at the end of the day, some individuals are a little bit more educated about their data and their privacy than others, but at the end of the day, it's the value that they get. So then it depends on the application itself. If I'm stressed out and then an app helps me de-stress, fantastic. So that's where we see that. But it's in our model, the end user experience is exactly the same. That, in the best possible case, the end user realizes that they're actually now, in full control of their data, they're getting the value from it and so on and so forth. But then, to be honest, in most cases, the end user doesn't really think about that. They just realize that, hey, this is a cool app, I'm using it. And then maybe after a point of time, they realize that, oh, by the way, I'm actually using it without sharing any data. That's pretty cool.
So what response are you seeing? Do you already have developers using the platform, building their applications? What can our listeners see?
We do. We do have those. We've been testing out with these over 20,000 developers now for about a year and a half, letting them build out anything, just say that, anything goes in a sandbox. And now we're essentially looking at, okay, we have end-to-end everything supported. So we're just adding more data sources, more of these utilities and tools for the developers. But at the same time, also, we're being slightly tactical in terms of how we're rolling this out, so that we're keeping everything under the radar for now. And then we're essentially allowing some of our partners to utilize our framework elsewhere. So we can bake it in, but you won't know that it's actually there in the background. This allows us to get really unbiased feedback from end users because, if there's just a lot of folks that this concept resonates with, then we're not going to get unbiased feedback. I mean, they're going to be excited about lots of different things. But if we essentially are able to get into an existing client relationship where a user expects a certain level of service, and then we can deliver that without them kind of seeing let's say an interruption, but then only afterwards say that, hey, by the way, did you know that you can actually use this without, with full privacy and full control and so on and so forth. I think the broader sentiment that we see in the market is that when we started out a couple of years ago, we started looking at, is there going to be a huge shift in the data market where essentially the data market might be more open and might be more free in the future, that anybody could build data applications. And I think a couple of years ago, there was a lot more skepticism. But where we are now, it's actually developed a lot quicker than what I would have expected. And I think part of it has been the pandemic, because there's been so much of internet usage. There's been a huge uproar in the data breaches and data privacy, and just being able to stay compliant. That's also not an easy thing for a lot of companies, as you guys know. But it's also something that, I think it's brought a lot of attention to this, that, maybe kind of the reactive model to data privacy and kind of data breaches, maybe that's not the only thing that you can do. Maybe you can also essentially build applications a different way. If I were to take, let's say, the most outlandish position, I would just say that, all of the applications today are built wrong. That all the applications are built in a way that you're sending your data to a server, and that data should actually stay with you. Now, that's an outlandish statement because you can't change that. But, that is a position that 2 years ago I would have been very, very nervous to take. But now it seems like that's also increasing in the appetite in the market, that maybe in 10 years we don't have a few data monopolies. Maybe we have more of an open market because, who knows? But it seems like the situation that we have today isn't totally sustainable anymore.
I'm just wondering, and Markus, this may not be something that you have an answer to because it may be too legal for you as an engineer, but I'm wondering whether this could be part of a solution to the whole international transfers discussion. Because if data is only processed locally on device, is there actually a transfer taking place?
And even if there is, it is pure consent.
Yes, so this is a really interesting question, and you're right. I am not qualified to give that answer. But just to add a couple more dimensions to that, we can also give the user the choice in terms of where their personal cloud is and where essentially all of this happens. Like, for example, we can have local territories where your data essentially stays right next to you. And then when you travel, for example, you would still have the data next to you where you live. And you can kind of keep this. There's also the latency aspect, that it's not just about the legal residence of the data, but it's also about like, what is the let's say, how far are you sending the data? And that's something that's been maybe the biggest technological driver, because if we're talking about big data sets, it doesn't make sense to send it back and forth. That's going to be overkill. So if you can keep it, for example, in your city and have like your own personal device and then cloud in your own city and then utilize it there. But we do like my general sense of GDPR and all of these regulations is that I'm kind of wondering what's next. Because the interesting thing about GDPR for me, or one of the interesting things, is this notion that I actually have a right to my data. That me as an individual, I can request it from different places and they have the legal requirement to give me that data. Now I can't do anything with a huge spreadsheet of different types of points, and that's in part Prifina's job to make that somehow useful. But it also seems like a stepping stone. It doesn't really seem like the end goal. Where the end goal, at least from what I interpret, would be that we would somehow transition into let's say, a better model or a new model. But that's something that we'll have to see, because right now it just seems like, for example, in Europe, it seems like there's a huge gap in the market where we have very, very strict and stringent measures under GDPR, but then I just refuse to believe that, pop-ups and, these types of tick boxes are like the end goal of GDPR. Like, there has to be something better at the end of the rainbow.
Well, I'm pretty sure. And that's also part of what we are trying to do. I mean, we haven't gotten rid of the check boxes and the banners yet, but it's still part of what we are hoping to do going forward. And indeed, GDPR is certainly not about being a tick box exercise. In the end, it is about user control, about companies taking responsibility and better oversight. And I think that combination, still, it's only 3 years, but we are not there yet in achieving those purposes.
Markus, we're coming close to the end of our time as we try to hit right around 35 minutes for people. So when you were coming on our podcast, was there anything that you wanted to make sure you were able to share with our listeners that we haven't touched on yet?
I think we've got the gist of it, and you're right. So one of the actual lawyers in our team, Paul, he's our ex-Google Harvard guy, and he's the guy that got in touch with you because he loves what you guys are doing as well. He's written a couple really interesting papers about like GDPR and personal ownership of data and so on and so forth. So those are things. He could
absolutely have come on.
Yeah, but I love also kind of bringing in, especially because I was thinking about the discussions that you guys also have a lot of times in the audience and kind of the participants. Then it may also be really interesting to just talk about the broader themes, so to speak, and kind of what we expect. So my main goal was really just to make sure that there's a lot of things that are changing, not just with, let's say, the way that we handle privacy or data breaches or data handling, but also the way that we actually build applications in the future. And I think that that's a really, really cool to be part of, cool market change to be part of, but it will take time. But from my point of view, I mean, that really the main message, I would say, from my side, but it's just lovely to chat with you guys.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. And we'll make sure to link also to the more academic papers in the show notes. We've got some of them in the email correspondence, so I'm happy to include those. And we know our listeners like reading those as well. I know that I enjoyed reading them.
Well, and also our listeners should know just on your website, the information that you've got available there. You have an area for people's data, for them to learn what happens. You've got a space for developers, for them to figure out what happens. Lots of resources there, the different things. And you've got a Slack channel that people can sign up for open collaboration and community, and they can join your Slack channel there. So I want people to know that when we give you the links to these, there's lots of resources there that you can get in on the conversation with Markus and his team and figure out what's going on there. I have a feeling there's a lot of really cool information.
There was one point that UK touched on, that there is this page, which is about the data sources that you have. I think it's prifina.com/yourdata. And the interesting thing is that we oftentimes don't really realize what type of data sets we actually have and what type of data sets we have access to. So just going on that page, there's a combination of like 20, 30 different types of sources and the instructions for how to get that data. Now, It's just a website. It's just something that you can play around with it. You can check out that what type of data can I actually get. But then our job kind of starts from there, that how can we turn those data sets into something that actually gives you even more value? Because companies are only going to build their one apps or one product, but you have this data. So if you can
essentially... And there's only one you.
That's right. There's only one you, but there's countless of developers that if they can build on that data, they can create really, really cool applications that you can utilize.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's really cool.
And on that note, thank you, Markus, for joining us. Thank you to our listeners for joining another episode of Serious Privacy. And if you like our series, please do tell your friends and colleagues about us. Rate and review our episodes in your favorite podcast app or on your favorite podcast platform. Should you have any questions or suggestions, please reach out to us via seriousfivacy@trustarc.com, via our LinkedIn page, just look for Serious Privacy, or via Twitter @podcastprivacy. You'll find Kay on Twitter as Heart of Privacy, and myself as your old Paul B. Until next week, goodbye.
Bye, y'all.
That was Serious Privacy.
If you're a data protection or privacy professional, you already know the pressure. Non-stop regulatory change, AI oversight, internal demands, and the expectation to somehow stay ahead of it all. And the old patchwork of tools just isn't cutting it anymore.
No. That's why TrustArc created a modern privacy management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. The TrustArc platform brings your workflows, evidence, research, tasks, and applications all together in one unified and intelligent workspace so you don't waste time digging, clicking, or context switching.
With Ask Arc, your privacy assistant, you can ask plain language questions about laws, jurisdictions, or even your own program data, and get credible, cited answers based on NIMBY research and more than 1,000 global laws. It's explainable, transparent, and purpose-built for data protection and privacy.
So if you need to add a vendor, create a cookie banner, or start an assessment, quick actions take formally complex tasks, turn them into bite-sized guided workflows to save you time.
It's a platform that thinks like you, works like you, and helps you move faster with confidence, whether you're a seasoned DPO or you're just getting started.
See how modern privacy gets done. Explore Arc at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.